It's freezing.
Good evening and welcome everybody to our Committee of the Whole for July 25th. I am sitting in as chair. I want to go ahead and call to order our meeting. And first up, we have a discussion, the first of our summer school program. Nate, please take it away.
Better, Kevin? Come on, buddy. There we go. He reminded me to speak directly into the microphone. He was very upset with me earlier when I wasn't talking heartily into this. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of the 17-part series on economic development here in the city of Gahanna, or 6. Relax, Councilman, it's fine.
It's going to be that kind of night, is it?
I'm here to bring the humor and a little bit of levity to a normally dry topic. And to the citizens who are here, I apologize in advance. Tonight's agenda, economic development, back to basics. So what is economic development? The tools in the toolbox, incentives, special entities, and miscellaneous items. I had sent some readings to the council beforehand, so hopefully you had a chance to take a look at that a little bit. If not, we're going to go through it at a real high level and then hopefully open up some Q&A.
Was that 328? Was that the 328s that we had to read?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I gave you a ton of readings.
Yeah, you did.
I always like to lead off economic development conversations with this slide. It is, what is economic development? And so what my friends think I do is I travel the world recruiting businesses to come to my community. What my family thinks I do is not much. What the public thinks I do is oftentimes talk about incentives, which we'll actually be talking about this evening a little bit. What elected officials think I do is just do groundbreakings. What I think I do is make a difference in my community, and what I actually do is lose my mind. And so there's a lot of nuance in a lot of this work that we do here. A lot of the time it is around economic programming, incentivization, the financials, but in the reality, what we're trying to do is strengthen our tax base, create opportunities for our residents to live, work, and invest in our communities, and by doing so, build better cities, build better infrastructure, build better schools. But I always like to use a little levity here with this slide as to what I actually do. I know the mayor does not like this slide whatsoever. A little bit in the tools in the toolbox. So to begin with, last year we had a couple programs come through, a couple projects, specifically Mill Street and ADB Safegate, and as part of that council's makeup, there was a lot of questions around tax abatement, so I thought I'd easily start off with, what the heck is one? Give the 101s. In Ohio, there's 2 types of tax abatement incentivizations. There's a community reinvestment area, or CRA, and enterprise zone. That enterprise zone is actually exclusive to county level governments only. Enterprise zones are historically in unincorporated areas, so think townships within county governments. There are a few enterprise zones within municipal areas, but those enterprise zones have historically been previously unincorporated areas that were then incorporated. So that enterprise zone program doesn't go away. For purposes of the Gahanna, we are CRA exclusive. We have 5 CRA areas. We'll go through each one of them this evening a little bit. The real key distinction between our CRAs are what's called pre and post 1994. What does that mean? Well, on July 1st of 1994, the Ohio Revised Code was changed by the state legislature. And that basically said that if you were an incorporated community reinvestment area made prior to July 1st of 1994, so June 30 or earlier of 1994, you were considered pre. That means that under the prior laws of the program from the Ohio Revised Code, or ORC, you were fully entitled to those incentivizations. There was no negotiations with your local councils, school districts, you name it. It was considered a baseline entitlement, just like zoning or anything else. Everything after July 1st of 1994 is called a post-1994 CRA. That means everything's on the table from a negotiation standpoint. You'll see in the slide deck here a little bit, there's been some adjustments to Gahanna's over the years. And ultimately, the city, even in its pre-94 CRA status, had, not necessarily has, but had the authority to adjust it to meet the needs of the community. And we'll talk a little about what that means as well as we go through the different districts. But that's really the distinction. And I want to make sure we all understood that a little bit, that pre and post 94, because that's real critical as it relates to this specific program. This outlines a lot of what that means. So this table is actually from the ODOD website, Ohio Department of Development. In the pre-94, it was all determined on what your authorizing resolution did. So, for example, let's say the CRA number 5, Councilman, which is our pre-94, it lists what can and cannot be utilized in that originally authorizing legislation. You can go up to 10 years on the residential remodels, up to 12 years on multi-unit remods. Residential new construction was up to 15. Commercial industrial was up to 12 remodels, and then new construction was 15. What does that mean? It means that as a pre-94, you can go up to those values, but those values were initially established by the council. So the state government basically allowed cities and villages to police their own levels, if I may. You can choose what you want to do in that pre-94 status. In the post-July 1 status, these are all negotiated. So these are things that then the council, school districts, and those are typically the two big voting parties, right? So oftentimes you'll see, if we did not have a funding agreement with the schools, whenever we had a CRA application come into the city of Gahanna right now for our post-94 CRAs, we would have members of council and the schools negotiate that, bring those receiving applications back to this body as a whole, and then act on it independently, hoping that we would coalesce some level of agreement through that process. Because of our current agreement with the schools, everything's approved pending this body's approval. They waive their right to it, but then they want fully compensated for it. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the slide deck. So what do we have? So these are some of the zones that we currently have. CRA number 1 is a post-1994 CRA. It actually dates back to the early 80s, but it's been amended multiple times. So that was the one thing I did not mention on the prior slide. When you have a pre versus post, if the public body that governs that CRA amends it 3 times, expands it, adjusts the values, anything of that nature, it reverts to that post-94 status. So you get what's called 2 bites at the apple. If you want to expand the territory, if you want to adjust the values that are eligible within the CRA, you can do so. But the minute you do it a 3rd time, now it's a post-94 CRA, and so the values drop considerably. So in this situation, a CRA number 1, post-94, you see the values there. I should also note that in post-94 CRAs, you start at 50% under the Ohio Revised Code. So the baseline for this is a 10-year 50% abatement on improved values within the dwelling 2 units, commercial industrial remods, and the commercial industrial space. Everything above that is a negotiation between the schools, the city in this instance, and the developer or end business owner. Now, does that make sense? CRA number 2, I call this the Grody CRA. This is actually exclusively around the Donato's property at Taylor Station Road. And so these include the Donato's headquarters facilities, the Grody manufacturing facility, and their R&D facility. This is a pre-94 CRA, so it's a current baseline. It's only for industrial uses. So although the council, when it originally formed this CRA, allowed for dwelling remods and commercial industrial housing remodels, just like any other traditional CRA, in reality, all you have there is commercial and industrial uses. And so it's that last one that matters in this instance. So it's a 15-year, 100% on the improved values tied to those improvements there on near and around the corner of the Taylor Station Road area. CRA number 3, this is a post-1994 CRA. This is essentially Central Park, so the former Brownfield site where we have a lot of that industrial development going around it now. It's been reclaimed. It's now the Golf Depot, with the golf course on top and the driving range. That's all part of this project here. We have those number of different out parcels that go around Tech Center Drive and Science Boulevard. That's all inclusive here. Again, predominantly this area is industrial commercial, and so you see a lot more in that 15-year, 100% on the improved values for new construction, but certainly some of the commercial industrial remods of up to 12 and up to 100%. Again, this is a post, so when we have applications, so my presumption, Mayor, and I wasn't here just yet for this, when the folks from Edison Brewing and the Peak at Edison came in a few years ago for their incentivization, that was a negotiation, for example. That was a project that was in this area that they negotiated those values with to create jobs in that office building as well as the brewery next door. CRA number 4, this is a pre-94 CRA. This is one that I think this council and body is most familiar with. This is where the Crescent is. So this is the office center area. So think lower part of Central Park. There's 2 different CRAs there. The lower part is where the office buildings are. This is where the former Zulily building was. This is where the AEP corporate office is, as well as where I mentioned earlier, the Crescent project is on the western side of this CRA. My earlier point about how the council can decide how things are adjusted in pre-94s. In this instance, the council did 2 things. The first thing that the council did after it created this CRA back in the late 80s, was expand it. So you actually, the first bite of the apple was the expansion of it to include portions of where Buckles Court and the expansion of Tech Center Drive is currently located closer to the airport. The second bite at the apple was actually the reduction of value. So originally this CRA was set up to be a 15-year, 100% abatement, and the council adjusted those values to what is currently the 10-year, 80% maximum value on it. That counts as an adjustment or a revision to the CRA. If someone were to make another amendment to the CRA, it would become a post-94 CRA. So my suggestion as a professional in this capacity, given the level of development that's happening over there, I would not amend it. Those are values that are kind of pro forma into what's happening in that area. It could have a detrimental effect long-term to what's happening over in that portion of the city. And finally, CRA number 5. This is essentially it's called in the box West Side, but it's really from the farthest terminus on Granville Street is essentially the library property, if you can, you know where the library is, going west through Creekside and Old Gahanna, and then into the west side areas along West Johnstown Road, Stiegler, Agler areas, etc. You see the values there again, dwelling and remodels, commercial industrial housing remodels, and then the new construction activities. We just actually had one of these come through, the Ohio HD, and their work over there on the west side went through a pre-94 application with my office for approved for a 10-year or 12-year 100% abatement on the improved values that they did over there. They actually invested over $1 million into their facility to modernize their building during COVID, and they just applied it for the most recent round of property tax inclusions. It did not require us city council action as it's a pre-94. The posts are what come forward to you, but that was one that just came through as part of our process here in our department.
Can I ask what building that was?
Yes, ma'am.
What business that was?
Ohio HD, they're the, Mayor, actually you may know what they do
Are
more
they on
effectively.
Agler Road?
They're in the former Wonder Bread building.
Okay, gotcha.
And they did a multi-tenant expansion there, so they fitted out some new office building for additional tenants, but they also certainly invested money into their space as well. Any other questions before I move on? I think this is the last slide on CRAs. It is. The other principal program that we have here in the city of Gahanna is TIFs, tax increment financing. What I tend to think about with this, especially if you haven't worked on TIFs or aren't have a high familiarity with TIFs, is, you know, how does it work, what's eligible, and for how long as it is? Well, quite candidly, this chart is the best thing there is for a TIF. I'm going to break this down in the most simplistic fashion I can. Anytime something is TIFed, your base value is set at that year 1. And those taxes attributed to that year 1 value will be paid every year to those various taxing bodies for the next 30 years. period. Any improvements, any incremental value change from that year one is then captured and diverted into the TIF fund. Now, we've talked a little bit about here at this body and some other meetings about what a non-school TIF is. A non-school TIF is just that. It sets the year one value for everything but school value. So then schools continue to get paid as incremental value increases on property, but the other non-school related values, so city taxes, any county related taxes, other levies that may be on that property, are still diverted into the TIF fund. That is captured and utilized to pay off eligible expenses related to the Tiff Ordinance. Here's the fun part of that statement. Who sets the Tiff Ordinance? You set the Tiff Ordinance. As a governing body, City Council has exclusivity in determining what is eligible and ineligible for TIF legislation. In our TIFs, predominantly it's infrastructure, but we have a number of TIFs that also include language around public service facilities, public safety facilities, and then specifically articulate intersection improvements. It can get very detailed or stay very broad. But the City Council is who sets the authorizations as to what is and is not eligible for TIF inclusion. Those values are redirected for 30 years, and at the end of that 30-year period, that TIF fund for that project or that property is dissolved, and then the new taxes on year 31 are dispersed as if they would normally have been the entire time. Does that make sense? I mean, that's about as nitty-gritty as it gets with TIF, and it's one of the most powerful tools that we have from a public financing standpoint, because TIF funds everything. So I always like using this picture of the bachelor, because the most eligible thing we have is infrastructure. Don't laugh, Councilman Renner. You know it's funny.
That's a stretch, Nate.
It is.
That's a stretch.
It is the most eligible bachelor in Gahanna. Infrastructure improvements. Storm sewers, water lines, sanitary trails, creek improvements, all of these things are eligible under TIF. And so as we continue to expand our tax bases and capture TIF funds, it's important that we continue to evaluate where the city's growing and what the city's needs are, because TIF is one of the best tools that we have, not only to plan for the future, but implement current projects. And as always, when in doubt, check your authorizing ordinance for a listing of eligible expenses. Director Ballmer is somewhere behind me taking a note because I owe her an email about eligible expenses related to facilities and TIF. Don't I? But always check your authorizing legislation. The other tool that we have that's exclusively Gahanna's to manage and operate is our office and industrial incentive, or income tax. Under our statute, and we'll talk actually a little bit about this tonight, as I have an ordinance before this body to review. We allow for some level of rebate or refund or whatever term you wish to use in this space to be considered for new business expansions. Now, under our city guidelines, that program cannot be commingled with other incentivization programs. So you can't mix a CRA with an O&I, for example. That's excluded as part of the guidelines. But we do allow for that level of consideration when trying to attract a new business. The example I provided here was someone who's going to give a $10 million anticipated payroll at 2.5% income tax. The city would give a 25% rebate over a 5-year term. The overall value would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.25 million. The city would receive $937,500, and the company would receive $312,000 over that term. Real simple. We'll actually go fairly deep into this a little later this evening over a project that we have up for consideration tonight. But this is another one of those tools that we have available here in the city of Gahanna. Councilman Weaver, you have this look of many questions.
No, I'm good for right now.
Okay.
You have him mesmerized.
I doubt that. This is what he looks like when he's sleeping with his eyes open. It's fine. Other things that you should be known about with economic development, and this has actually come up previously in this room. Special units of government community improvement corporations, what are they? We've talked a little bit about this at the most recent joint meeting of CIC and City Council. Mr. Hicks is here from the CIC. I believe he's here as his planning commission capacity this evening. But he's also on my board, as are Mr. Weaver and Mr. Renner and Mayor Jadwin and no one else in this room. Just want to make sure I didn't have to make any more call-outs. The goal of a CIC is to help aid in economic development activities within your city. It's also defined by the resolution. So a city government or county government. So I come from before joining the city of Gahanna, I worked for a county that authorized the CIC to do a number of activities on its behalf. Here in Gahanna, you exclusively give some leeway in the economic development assistance of opportunities and activities, as well as land disposal. Essentially, the CIC is serving as your land bank here locally. But there are a number of different resources that if the city of Gahanna woke up tomorrow and said, you know what, we don't want Nate Strum to be a city employee, we want to be an employee of the CIC, you could empower the CIC, dissolve my department. I'm not suggesting this by any means. Please do not dissolve my department.
It's like, where are you going with this?
I'm giving an example, but I don't like where it's going. This is one of those free thought moments where like, I wish to back up about 5 minutes ago. But things that you can think about as it relates to CIC, but predominantly here in Gahanna, we're utilizing it as a land banking capacity. NCA, so this came up as part of the Crescent Project. And NCA is another special union of government which has independent bonding capacity, allows for NCA charges, new community authority charges, community development charges. In short, what ends up happening here is that a public body, such as City Council, establishes the parameters of which a new community authority can be implemented. And as such, that new community authority can implement various taxes, levies, and liens within the property which it governs to govern higher levels of parks, infrastructure improvements. They're all defined as part of the petition to create that NCA. Sounds really complicated, right? Not really. Most common one in the region right now, Bridge Park. And that what you see right there is actually a sample of a receipt that you would get when you go to Bridge Park and you would purchase something. Every transaction in Bridge Park has a 0.5% tax on it. That's the NCA charge, and that's done before taxes. So you still pay a tax on a tax. It's fun. Welcome to economic development. But that pays for their infrastructure, their roads, their garages, you name it, and it's all defined within that parameter. That's what the NCA pays. Who's been to Tanger Outlets up in Delaware? That's also an NCA. You pay a 1% NCA charge on everything you buy at Tanger. And that pays for the roadway improvements in and out of the outlet mall. That pays for the road and bridge improvements over at the interchange. So that's one of the ways that this program is utilized to help offset those major costs.
Nate, is that always 0.5%?
No, it can be whatever's defined in the petition. That's a great question. It's really key, so it really depends on what the final budget is. I'm going to go back one slide. It really depends on what the petition for the creation is, the level of infrastructure investment is, and note that the new community authority does not go away. It doesn't have an expiring timeline to it. So once it's created, it's there. Actually, and I'll say this, another really great tool for NCA, the New Albany Beauty Park. That's an NCA. So they have fees baked in that are taken out of the project, even with the abatements that may be on property. There's still fees tied there, and they fund infrastructure improvements and other activities as well. A SID. This is a special improvement district. This is something actually Councilman Renner and I had a decent conversation about the other day. This is a special unit of government. This actually does have an expiring timeline on it. It cannot exceed 10 years. Those SIDs can be renewed. So that's a little bit of a misnomer. It has to include 60% of the frontage of all real estate upon a public right-of-way within a defined area, or 75% of all property located within that district. What does that mean? Essentially, 60% of people who front roads, or 75% of everybody, has to be involved in this. Once done, They can assume similar fees to an NCA. They can do taxing fees, charge fees to customers on commercial real estate activities. There can be a SID fee on the conveyance of property. I'm showing here over the Rhine. This is a SID in Cincinnati. That, their SID has specific guidelines that have a SID charge towards different activities in the district, and then it funds public parks, public art, historic renovations in their defined neighborhood. There's a board that's created. It's representative by both the city government there in Cincinnati as well as local neighborhood officials. They govern it. They administer these dollars on an annual basis, and those programs are implemented. Here locally, the most common known SID is Nationwide Arena. That's a SID. So when you look at the planters that are down by Nationwide or the special security details that are down by Nationwide, those are all paid through the SID. And then there's the ESID. So this is the Energy Special Improvement District, and we're actually already a part of this. This is a special designation under the Ohio Revised Code in which energy property owners who wish to have energy efficient improvements, say that 5 times fast, done on their property can petition to be added to the ESID. This body did that in 2020, I believe. We had a petition by one church here in Gahanna to be added to the Franklin County Columbus Finance Authority ESID program. I'm the representative on that body, so I work with Patty Huddle and Jean Carter Ryan on those ESID applications for their body now. But this is a mechanism to support PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy Programming. I'm not going to go through the nuance of PACE. We can if you'd like to. But in short, what PACE is a new, different financing tool that allows for entities to take advantage of energy efficient improvements on their property at a low interest rate. But instead of having to pay that back as a loan traditionally, it's paid back as an assessment. So I take out $1 million loan. Normally I have a debt service of X over 25 or 30 years. But instead, I want to pay an assessed value that's paid out just like property tax. It's just added to my property tax bill on an annual basis, and that's covered that way. It conveys with ownership. So if I sell my property in 5 years, that ESID PACE can either stay with the property or be cleaned and scrubbed at the time of transaction. Just depends on what the interest of the new ownership group is. What we see a lot of times with this, churches do a lot of ESID improvements, so HVACs, window improvements, roof improvements, that all can be included as part of the ESID program. Historic structures like to do this a lot if the ROI gets really tight on their renovation costs. They'll pull this out and do a special assessment on it, especially if they're getting some level of tax abatement. So that they'll essentially the lowered tax abatement liability on the assessed value from the county auditor is then balanced out with a PACE payment. Things like that. But it's a nice program. It's not widely used here in Ohio. It is widely used in a lot of other municipalities. I did a lot of these programs in Pennsylvania back in my prior life, especially around solar panels, residential solar panel installation, things of that nature. So that's this in a nutshell. That's 20 slides, and I don't know how quick that was. If you did the pre-reading, that was a really nice review for you. If you didn't do the pre-reading, it's like Spanish.
Weaver.
I knew you were going to have a question. I could see in your face 10 minutes ago.
Well, Director, first, thank you very much for the presentation, for the pre-reading. It's greatly appreciated, and I would encourage everyone, if you are having trouble sleeping, the Ohio Economic Development Manual that the Director sent out and can be found on the Attorney General's office website is actually very helpful.
It's over 1,000 pages of nonsense. Read it.
A lot of very helpful information in there, and it was beneficial to reading before your presentation, so thank you. A couple of questions.
Sure.
Wonder if you can touch a bit on pilot payments and how and when they're used and the advantage to the municipality.
You're skipping ahead to session 3.
Okay, well then I'll table my question.
So I can answer that a little bit, but I actually do have a whole session about pilot payments, its arrangements, how it works, especially with residential developments and how we've used them historically with school compensation. So I have an entire session on school comp. So pilot payments, for those who do not know, I'm not talking about airline pilots being paid by the city of Gahanna. These are payments in lieu of taxes. What we end up doing here, oftentimes, we use our basic model here in the city of Gahanna, is if we have a pre-negotiated structure with our school district, the Gahanna Jefferson Public Schools. And as such, pilot payments are made annually. We make a determination as to what the loss of tax income would be to the schools based upon economic development projects that have happened here in the city of Gahanna for the past 12 months. And then we make pilot arrangements, typically through some Tiff monies. Joanne, you're here. Not GF, right? Just typically Tiff? That's what I thought. Most TIFs are, a lot of our older TIFs especially are overperforming, so they're able to utilize them and leverage them for these types of programs. But I have an entire session on pilots, how they work, why it matters, and why having, and it's essentially economic development and risk management. Trust me, it'll be a snooze fest.
I can't wait. May I ask another question?
Please, go ahead.
And perhaps you'll touch on this later. In terms of CRAs and, new company coming intends to add 25 jobs,
Yep.
retain 50. The readings mentioned penalties. Are those automatic for failure to meet those goals, or are those discretionary? If somebody says they're going to add 25 jobs, but they get 24, I mean, that's...
I'm trying to figure out if the guy whose day job is to work at the county auditor is giving me a leading question here or not. They are. They're at the discretionary of the government. So we have a tax incentive review commission, the TURC. It's actually administered by the Franklin County Auditor's Office. We have appointees to it. Mr. Hicks, I believe you're an appointee to the TURC. I don't think you showed this year. I don't think you showed this year. But we administer that program locally, and then we'll bring those minutes to the council. So right now, the recommendation from the city's TURC before the county auditor's office was that everything was in compliance per the original agreements. We'll make that same recommendation to this body once the minutes have been finalized by their stenographer from the county auditor's office. And then you make this council has discretion as to whether they accept those findings, reject those findings, or wish to amend those findings. We'll provide you with the same level of reports and conversations that we did at that meeting. Then it's your call. In my 17 years of doing this, I've had to revoke 2. And that's not a bragging moment, that's just a reality moment. Oftentimes, a lot of the agreements say words like good faith effort. So to your question, Mr. Weaver, they quit to 25 and they got to 24. Is that a good faith effort to get to 25? Oftentimes what we end up seeing now, and we saw this actually this year in the TURC, we saw lesser job numbers but higher payroll numbers. So based upon what their projections were 5 or 7 years ago, they thought they would need 30 jobs to get to $1.5 million in payroll. They needed 15. I think from my recommendation from a city government standpoint is we don't necessarily mind if the jobs are low as long as they're meeting their income tax estimations and goals associated with payroll. That's what we're really incentivizing through CRA. But that's obviously also your call as a governing body, not mine. But that's how we administer that program and how we have oversight. And that's an annual meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Also, if I may, Councilman?
Please.
This Thursday at 4:30 is our Community Reinvestment Area Housing Council meeting, otherwise known as CRAC Board, for the same thing that the TURC does, but on the housing side of it. So that'll be meeting this Thursday, I think, at 4:30, in person here at City Hall. And we'll be having a similar review of those projects that fall under its authority.
Very good.
Terrible
Any
name for a
questions?
board.
Comments? Well, Nate, you did not disappoint. I really do appreciate when Councilwoman Bowers and I came to you and the mayor and said, hey, can we craft a learning series? This was really good. You began with that this is like the toolbox, and you've given us enough, and the public,
Yep.
a lot of reading materials. And I'll just leave it at that.
It's fair.
But actually, in all sincerity, the link, and I really urge everybody to go because there is a plethora of good background information on this legislation.
We have fact sheets, we have maps, we have 1-2 page readings. I'm really, I make a joke about it here, but I'm really adamant about making sure that we provide knowledge and provide value in this space. Our next session in 2 weeks, I'm finalizing the arrangements. I believe Justin Bickle from One Columbus is going to come in. Really, he's a former Gahanna resident, was on the CIC for a number of years. He'll be speaking a little bit about the Jobs Ohio network. So one of the questions I get oftentimes in my role is, how do you get new businesses into the marketplace, and what does that mean? As well as what's the role of regionalism in economic development, and what's the role of Gahanna in that place. So Justin will be here in 2 weeks. And then future sessions, to the Councilman's earlier comment, focusing on pilot arrangements, our relationship with schools, workforce development programming, housing. Have some guest speakers coming in for all those sessions. I'm just finalizing those dates now that we actually have this thing kind of mapped out a little bit. But you'll see some more of that coming down the pipeline a little bit. But what I'm excited about is the last session. The last session is really going to talk about economic development and pulling it all together. My goal is to provide you with all this information and then show you how actually a deal matters. How a CRA tax abatement impacts rent rolls, that contacts small businesses, that creates the small jobs, and how that whole cycle kind of pulls through. So stay tuned. I will try not to bore you too badly over the next 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 sessions. It's a little longer than that. And we'll go from there.
Okay, good. Thank you. I called this legislation, it should be called a communication, so sorry. All right, next on our agenda is item C, items from the Department of Economic Development.
And I'm back. I'll wait for Kevin to pull that up. The map, is this the SIB item?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Kevin, you could pull up the Google Earth map for me, please. As many of you may remember, with the ADB project that was approved by council last year, as part of that, we pursued various dollars through Ohio Department of Development, ODOD, as well as ODOT. Right there, buddy? As we've gone through the project, and if you haven't been out to Science Boulevard recently, you should go out and take a look. They are moving heaven and earth and going gangbusters on that land from a site standpoint. The Tech Center Drive, which is the area, the extension that's highlighted in blue on the top of that, is also part of that project. And that's the extension of Tech Center Drive to serve this property, as well as begin to catalyze what the rest of Tech Center Drive extending to Taylor Station could potentially look like. When we originally bid this project back in September to get the initial values attributed to ODOD and ODOT, the project was slated at about $560,000 for that road extension. That road extension has now gone up to $1.2 million. Now, a lot of that is attributed to public infrastructure improvements that were originally captured under the ODOD and ODOT programming, specifically water and sewer lines. With these increased costs, we need to find a new interim financing tool to get the project moving on the Tech Center Drive standpoint. And that's where the SIB comes in. The SIB is a state infrastructure bank. It's actually administered through Ohio Department of Transportation. It's a it's about the lowest interest rate loan you can get to support infrastructure development. It's at 1% right now. What we're focusing on right now is getting the authorization to go pursue these funds. My goal would in 2 weeks come back to this body with a reimbursement agreement that would partner with the developer in this instance, which this council can then review. We will be supporting that program with our ODOT grants, our ODOT grants, our ODOD grants, ODOT grants, the TIF funds that were previously appropriated under prior legislation, as well as some water funds to support the upsizing of the increased costs of the water lines. I don't have the full value of those costs are just yet. We're still working through the engineering process, but my goal would be to get the SIB underway. I want to get it applied for because there's a little bit of a lag time there too, about 60 days from submission to authority to enter into agreement, which gives us plenty of time to address the rest of the model if that makes sense, in 2 weeks when I come back to talk through the reimbursement agreement.
Okay. Any questions, comments? You are asking for a waiver and emergency on this?
Yeah, so I can file it ASAP.
Right. Is everybody okay with consent, or should we go regular? Consent?
Again,
Okay.
I'm just filing it. I'm not asking necessarily to enter into any
Yep.
agreements or anything. That'll come back through.
Understood. Thank you. All right, next item.
Next up, actually is an O&I. So thank you, Kevin, for pulling this up. My office was contacted by a company, the Columbus Aesthetics and Plastic Surgery CAPS office. They have a current office located in Upper Arlington. They're looking to expand into the East Side Marketplace. They reached out to me about the availability of the former Penzone facility on Cherry Way near Morse Road in Gahanna. In reviewing the opportunity with them, we identified the O&I as really the only thing to support this type of an opportunity for them from an incentivization standpoint. We're competing with multiple municipalities who are offering much better incentives, quite frankly. If you look through this a little bit, and I can get you I think the intake forms also was provided the application as a number of jobs, but in short, you're talking about, I think it's 50 jobs. Kevin, can you go over to year 2028 at full build out? 52 jobs at about $150,000 a year jobs. These are all high-end medical positions locating here in the city. When we look through a lens of what we thought would be appropriate from a incentive advisory committee, we had hoped to do what you see here. So the total investment of a 50% for 10 years gets a value of the incentive at about just over $500,000, but the city would get about $1.75 million. And so it was a nice balancing act of about 230 some odd percent return on investment. So if we were to contribute $500,000 of our tax base through reimbursable, we would receive 1.75, and then that grows exponentially subsequently thereafter when the incentive rolls off. This is a performance-based incentive. This means that if they don't meet their job performance goals, that number's lesser. If they exceed their job performance goals, that number grows. But that's actually a good thing for us because we would be getting more income tax in itself as well. The one key here is to get to the valuation that made sense for us to be competitive with other neighboring communities who are also offering similar incentives and opportunities, was to waive the 5-year period. So under the city guidelines, the council has the ability to waive any and all of those guidelines to meet in a competitive opportunity. The guidelines suggest a 5-year term maximum. I'm asking for a waiver of that maximum from 5 years to 10 years so that we can max us out and be competitive with our neighboring communities that are also trying to incentivize this opportunity. As you can see, I think this is high level of value to the city of Gahanna long term. To give you some perspective, just looking at year 2023, they'll be contributing $75,000 of net income to the city. I also broke it out. There was a question as part of the incentive review committee as to the issue $12, the 1% versus the non-issue $12. That's why you see that note in there. But as you see through the programming itself, by year year 5 of the program, they reached over $100,000 of net income into the city, non-issue $12. And that number continues to grow exponentially over the years. So I think this is a worthwhile endeavor if the body so chooses. Also note, we're only incentivizing the non-issue 12 related funds. So this is a 50% credit on the 1.5% non-issue 12 income tax. So we're going to be collecting the entire 1% on the issue 12 and capturing 50% of the non-issue 12 income tax on that. So it's actually a net income credit of 30%.
Nate, in the agreement,
Sir.
you have up on the board, and you did say 52 jobs, but it says 65 new jobs.
Go out to year.
Oh, so you're saying, okay, gotcha. All right, I just wanted to catch that. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Weaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you, looking at the ROI document, it mentions 15 years in that box to the left. I just want to click, the term is for 10 years.
Correct. I just showed you what at 5 more years after that.
Got it. Just wanted to make sure.
What that return on investment would capitalize to. I could do another 5 years after that, show you the full 20.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Nice job.
Okay, consent agenda, no need to come back? Is that good? Yes, sir. Okay. Good. Thank you, Nate. I
Thank
really
you very much.
appreciate it. All right, item D, item from the city attorney's office. Ray, you have the floor.
Thank you. Sean, would you please come up there? I think you all know Sean McCarter, our outside counsel. He's appeared, I think, a couple times in front of you on previous things. I will not be as entertaining as Nate. I hope I keep you awake, Mr. Weaver, but we'll do our best, but this is extremely important. First, let's talk about how we got here. 2 weeks ago, I was contacted by the mayor on Monday saying, hey, a major legal issue has come up at our meeting with the schools, and we need to talk about it. So we talked about it. Sean and I met with the attorneys for the school, I believe on that Wednesday, worked all the way through it. Come that Friday, the attorneys had a good idea of what we're presenting to our clients as to a way to resolve this problem. And on Monday, this past Monday, a week ago, not close enough. This past Monday, a week ago, we ended up deciding this is how we're going to pursue it. So in this last week, let's see, the school has 2 attorneys, an engineer, the developer, the people from the schools. We have 2 attorneys, the mayor, Caitlin, Grant, Michael. We had 12 intelligent people who had slightly different points of views, and we're trying to put this into writing to get what everyone wanted and what everyone thought would work. Friday at about 4 o'clock, I think it finally was, we got this together. So that's why everything took so long. So I apologize to Jeremy already for us not having it on time. I'm apologizing to you for not having it on time, but that is why. What are we doing? If you look at the whereas clauses, I think that kind of sets forth the reasons why this needs to be done. In it, it states that the board is in the process of designing and constructing its new high school and appurtenances at the existing Lincoln High School. If the project does not proceed immediately, project costs will increase significantly due to winter weather conditions, inflation, material supply chain issues, and labor shortages. If the project is not able to commence immediately, it will disrupt the board's spending forecast for Phase 2 of the Master Facilities Project, which will have a negative ramification on the IRS guidelines related to the tax-exempt status of the bonds. The result will be a significant increase in cost to the board, projected to be multiple millions of dollars. So what we're trying to do is help the schools save millions of dollars so that our residents save millions of dollars. That is what we're trying to accomplish through this. The problem we have is the school has an abbreviated timeline in which to fulfill the terms of their bonds. So what that means is they have to put shovel to dirt in August. And in order to do that, we had to find a way to accomplish that. The reason we have to find that is because of the Brownfield decision. It's a Supreme Court decision which Jeremy, I believe, had forwarded on to the council members. I've hoped you had a chance to read that. It was a very good article explaining how what Brownfield is about. But basically what it says is we're a political subdivision. The school's a political subdivision. They get funded by public funds. We get funded by public funds. They can't tell us what to do with our money. We can't tell them what to do with their money. But there are times in which our areas will collide. Buildings are the most of it, zoning and building construction. And so what we need them to do might be different than what they need to do. So Brownfield says, we got to work it out. We have to get together and we have to find a way to work this out. If we don't, it goes to court. If it goes to court, they have a weighing process and they decide what is the greater good to the most people. And then the court will decide who wins. But every case I've read from Brownfield and his progenies, the court always starts with, work it out, work it out. You guys need to get together and work it out. And that is what we're trying to do here. Now, there's a difference between the ordinance, or differences between the ordinance and, the resolution and the MOA. The memorandum of agreement is between us and the schools. The resolution is between us and council. This is what we're asking council. The resolution is what we're asking council to do to make this happen. And then the MOA is the agreement that we have with the schools. So the reason it's worded the way it is because there are two things. Council can suspend ordinances. They have that power, and that's what we're asking them to do temporarily. Council cannot suspend a charter, but I will say that Brownfield trumps the charter. So the Supreme Court decision would trump whatever our charter says, and so that's why we have to work within these parameters. So that's also why in this you'll see the second part of number 1, we say the Planning Commission isn't. So the short version is we're trying to circumvent some of the requirements under section 110806, or not circumvent, but put them off to a later time to allow the school to start digging so that they can fulfill the requirements of their bonds so that they don't lose millions of dollars. And so what happens is the thing I want to point out is this resolution only applies for the school or another political subdivision, or it can only be used for the school or another political subdivision. This is not something that a developer can use because it is only between people who have the ability for eminent domain. It's the eminent domain ability that makes it so that you have to work together. So this is not something we could use for other developers. It's the reason why I'm presenting it, because we don't want our development people to present it. We don't want the developers to think, hey, oh, well, let me do this. Well, you can't. It can only be done with another political subdivision. So we're taking a process that would normally take 8 to 18 months for this big of a deal process before they could ever put shovel to dirt. The reason for that is they'd have to have the final development plan, the design review, any variance applications, erosion control, and engineering approval. They all have to be completed before they can move dirt. So what we're trying to do is say, well, you don't have to do all that stuff. We are still saying they have to do the erosion control and the engineering approvals, but the other things, we'll work on them and we will get them done. It just doesn't have to be done before you could start moving dirt, which allows them to hopefully maintain their tax-exempt status for their bonds. Now, due to the school's condensed time frame, we had to find a compromise that would allow them to begin moving this and to save this money or to save the money that they could be losing. Thus, what we're doing is we're still requiring them to get the approvals of the engineer and of the erosion control, but we're just allowing them to start digging and doing demolition of the stadium and things like that. Keep in mind, under Brownfield, there's only certain things we can have them do. Health and safety, basically. So when it comes to our sewers, when it comes to the traffic impact studies, when it comes to the building code, those are all things that we would win under Brownfield because those are health and safety measures. There are other things such as the design of the school, where they're going to place the stadium, what the height of the fence behind it, those type of things. Those are things that would be handled normally by the Planning Commission. Those are not things that we can, those are things we would most likely not prevail in under Brownfield decision. So what we're doing is really something very small. We have limited, if you see in the MOA, it defines site work under number C, under paragraph C. That site work is what we're saying they can do. That is get started. And we'll allow you to get started without having all the final plans and approvals, with the agreement that we will do all the final plans and approvals in the future. And they have agreed also under that MOA that they will be liable for any overruns at this cost. So what can happen here, the reason we have all the final plans done at first before you can move anything, so that you don't have to go back and change things. If they do have to go back and change things, that's going to be on them. So that's what we're trying to do here. Sean was actually the one who put this together, so I had him here because he could probably answer questions better than better than me. But what I have to say is, what happens if we don't do this? Well, the school's going to be put in quite a position. And they're going to have to file suit, and they're going to have to file for a temporary restraining order. And we're all going to spend tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, and the judge is going to say, work it out. And they're going to present this agreement, which I feel is pretty reasonable, and the judge is going to say, yeah, it looks pretty reasonable. That's what you should do. So we're in a position where, in order for us to compromise and get this thing to work out and to save the school and hence our residents millions of dollars, we are proposing this resolution to accept this MOA. Now, questions? Or first, may I ask, Sean, is there anything you would like to add before they ask?
If I could just add in a couple of color pieces. Please. The attorneys for the schools, and Ray and I and a couple of the engineering types, a week ago Friday, were on a conference call, and they were kind of really hitting us with, you know, you've got to take this forward. And this was in follow-up to a request where they sent us an MOA that doesn't look anything like this one. It would be a kind of a blank, much more a blank check. And during that conversation, one of the things we said, well, you know, you don't get to connect to our sewers and overwhelm them. And you agree with that? Yeah, we agree with that. You know, the response in part back was, you know, we're already connected there and using from the site, so we ought to be able to at least use that. Well, okay, but you might be only limited to that until, you know, the sewer problem's ultimately fixed. And we know you want more capacity, you want than the site currently has, but until we have the, you know, until the capacity is established, you won't get that. Well, we can live with that. We can live with potentially our occupancy is limited to what we have now until future sewer problems are worked out. That's in here, by the way. That's one of the acknowledgments. But that sewer problem from a workout perspective is going to take some time, and they don't have the time to get that resolved to wait to move dirt. That was a big issue. The traffic issue is another one, and their need to do the studies, and we've specifically acknowledged that in here, and it provides in the MOA that it ultimately has to be approved by the city in accordance with controlling law. So those were two biggies. We called them the offsites, and that's how we dealt with that. Then ultimately, one of the big issues was really a timing standpoint for the on-sites, and that Planning Commission was set up to be a gatekeeper for many things, including what they do and what others do, to make sure that before you get the okay, everything's in place. And their position was, we'll deal with this as we go. What we need now is the okay to move dirt. So that was Friday. Monday, Ray and I and more of your internal engineering types got on a call and walked this through and kind of landed on we can get this at least 95% of the way there by requiring the compliance with, I'm going to use shorthand, building permits, engineering approvals, et cetera. What isn't there is potentially, you know, good idea, bad idea, use of the site by Planning Commission. That good idea, bad idea of using the land is that political subdivision
distinction. It's really in, they get a heavy vestment. They're charged with providing schools and how they develop the site, and they get to make decisions about that, and they get to make the decision about whether they gold plate the school or not. And the Brownfield case, there was a later case involving the city of Mentor, and couple of things it noted. It heavily noted the workout provision, which we're working on, and that if you ultimately don't meet the workout, you do the balancing test, and that goes to the courts. But one of the things the court noted said, in light of the applicability of Brownfield, two further conclusions inexorably follow. First, we hold that proceeding before the Mentor Planning and Zoning Commission was superfluous, because the determination whether Lake Train is immune from Mentor zoning resolution will be dispositive whether it can build the proposed park and ride facility. The Commission's denial of a request for a conditional use permit is meaningless. Simply stated, the hearings before the Commission should have never been held. The point being is you either work this out or you go to court. And the courts have held they're not required to follow permitting, zoning, variance, et cetera, type of processes. That's part of the workout. So in taking the position of trying to work it out and trying to come up with this timing thing and trying to develop a process that kept all of the specific, again, health safety is a shorthand, approval processes in place, this is what we came up with. We also, in seeking to review and keep a role for planning, have them as your gatekeeper to make sure that everything is in place before they will can make a recommendation to approve. Yes, they don't get to say good idea, bad idea, but they do still continue to serve their role as gatekeeper, which is one of their functions.
Thank you. Any questions?
Well, I was going to bring up the fact that, I was a teacher, so I understand this, what we want to do. And I think that, we certainly want to be responsive to what's going on here and what, but I'm trying to figure out how this got why this wasn't done many months ago, because obviously that was known. And if it wasn't known, why wasn't it known? It's because right now you would be doing, getting the shovels out. And I again, we can be really, it's part of our community. We want our community to be great. But I'm just trying to figure, can you tell me why this has happened? That we can...
Only in part. We're not the developing entity on this side.
Oh, yeah.
So, in other words, we didn't control the timing and the process or starting the bonding process and setting a payout schedule and all those types of things which are creating some of the issues here. It is my understanding that early warnings were given. The off-sites were always at issue, and those were two huge hurdles that we got, presented to us as being impediments to having the ability to tee this up to go before Planning Commission. We're not going to have our off-sites done in time, in any kind of timeline that will make this workable. That was a significant issue that was presented to us. Secondarily, splitting of some of the planning, again, a shorthand, the dirt moving versus the other activities. I don't think the city is doing anything differently than it would for anyone else, but as the school got into this process, this is where they have found themselves. I don't think the city drug its feet or anything like that, if that's what you're asking about. It's just that maybe there was an aha moment, but, several of the issues have been on the table for a while, and I don't know, the mayor was at the meeting, but it seems like they hit the crisis button.
I don't recall saying that, but, but.
Not you,
Oh.
but the school district to us, we're in crisis, you've got to come help us.
Well,
Not-
that, yes, that was, and as you mentioned earlier, that this really kind of evolved within the last, I'd say 2 to 3 weeks. So I think, first of all, it's important just to take a step back, and I know there's folks who are listening at home, because a lot of times there's confusion around the fact that the city and the schools are 2 separate and distinct legal entities. Everybody thinks, the city and the schools are all part of one. The schools get complaints about the city gets complaints about the schools, and it doesn't work that way. So the city's funded by income tax dollars, we're run by council, mayor, city attorney. The schools are led by a school board funded by property tax. So they have had their timeline for this project. I know it was announced back in, I think, January then, and they had a timeline they were working under. Well, we also have parameters. I think we first met as a team back in February 28th, I believe, and we walked through potentially what a calendar could look like. Understanding, as Mr. Malarski already said, that a project of this magnitude in any other circumstance would take about 8 to 18 months to go through all of the planning process, the review between the development of the final development plan, design review, the variance applications, because there are always variance applications of some sort. Yeah, the stormwater, looking at stormwater and erosion control and EPA requirements that have to be followed. This is a situation where we really are trying to balance the processes and parameters and code provisions that we have in place with the leniency that school districts have under the Brownfield case as established by the Ohio Supreme Court. So we want to try to reach a compromise of that, but also make sure that we are protected, that we have some mechanism, because there will be things that will be for the overall interest of the community. We mentioned traffic study, we mentioned sanitary sewer, all of those things that really will impact the surrounding community and the greater good, for lack of a better term. But we also recognize this is I can't even talk this morning. So it's this morning, it's the evening. This is a substantial, there we go, project for our community. This is a project that is a significant investment for the schools. It's sitting on probably the busiest intersection in the city of Ohio, in Gahanna, Ohio, and it is what I was going to say. It's on a major corridor through the regional, Mid-Ohio region, through Ohio is where I was headed with that. The impact of this project to our community is significant. We have to find a way to help support the schools move this forward and to find a compromise with this, again, within the confines of the Brownfield case, understanding what parameters they have under that case, understanding what we need to have in protection here. The timeline is not ideal, and I'm sure if everybody could do it over again, they would probably get an earlier start, and I think we'd all be better off for that. But at the end of the day, we're where we are, and they have to get shovels in the ground, and we need to help that, or else it's the taxpayers are going to pay for that. They're going to lose the tax exempt status here. So it is a city and a school. City and schools are in this together. It all takes a village to make this happen, and I think we've got to do what we need to do to help move this forward.
I think it's going to take a city to make this happen. No, not just a village, but a city. Now, I just question that, because it seems that if you knew that this was happening, was there something that happened that you couldn't come to where we should be? And I was here at one of them, where the Planning Commission had the people came in and said, whatever, and I was surprised then that the questions all came from the Planning Commission, and I want to thank you for making those things. So I'm not trying to think, I just want to get in my own head how this could happen, and if it's, it's been a long time since we've had a lot of building here, and it'd be wonderful to have a new high school, and I, just wanted to make sure that I still can't quite understand why it wouldn't have thing. But this, obviously, there's court things here, and I think it's right to be trying to do things to help our children and our teachers and our superintendents. And so, I'm just asking kind of the why. And I suppose I can grab one of those ladies sitting in there and they'll probably tell me why. But I just think that it's something that should come out. It's not our fault.
No.
Again, that's
And, that's why I said the school district, they were working through a process here. Maybe they had different expectations and so forth, but, we feel that things were brought forth, especially, again, these offsites were a big deal to this whole thing. And they, coming into that meeting of 2 weeks ago, expressed that there was a severe problem here. This is why the mayor then called Ray, and we got involved. And let's see, that evening at 4 o'clock, that was a Monday, we had a conference call with, the building engineering people were on it and so forth, and we worked through it, and then we started to work through the problem and trying to get our arms around what the issues were and so forth. So, the whys have more, I think, to do with the school than the city, but they just said they're in a bind, and we got going here.
thank you.
Mr. Snetzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Malarski, I think that's a pretty succinct way of boiling this all down, a very complex thing, to something that was somewhat understandable. But as a non-legal mind, I want to ask a clarifying question. It sounds like the process is not, certain steps along the way in the approval process are not necessarily being ignored or set aside. It's just that the order is being changed.
I think it's a very good way to put it, yes.
And also, I guess more importantly, those items pertaining to public health, safety, and welfare are not being changed. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I guess I'll just state that, essentially what we have is, I'm not trying to place blame on anybody. We have one political entity, which is the school board. It's the decision-making entity for the school district, and we have councils, another political entity. We're the decision-making body for the city of Gahanna. One political entity is asking another, hey, due to extenuating circumstances, here's what we need to move this forward for the benefit of the residents. And based on what I'm seeing, this seems to be a relatively reasonable request. And given that nothing's being ignored or not done, it's just that we're changing the order, it doesn't seem like too heavy of a lift for me, so I think it should move forward.
Thank you. Mr. Weaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here and for the additional commentary. Appreciate it, Mr. McCarter. And I think the mayor said it quite well, that with a project this size, things certainly come up. And I know that as this body looks at having future discussions for our own projects, that there are time constraints, and we'll be feeling those pressures as well. I think Mr. Schnetzer made an excellent point as well, that the oversight is still there. Just the order of these things are being adjusted slightly, but even the Brownfield decision makes clear. And Director Strum, you're not the only person who has signed a lot of reading for this week's meeting. If you read the Brownfield decision, the decision does not provide immunity to these health and safety requirements, as has been noted. And so, I think it is a reasonable request. And at the end of the day, with those health and safety measures being addressed and still being there, this comes down to protecting the taxpayers. And this would be the fiscally prudent decision. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ray for doing all the work there, and you too,
So,
I'm sorry, Mr. Councilman, but I was going to say, Mr. Malarski, I think probably worked solely on this project all of last week, along with Mr. Carter, as did Director Blackford, Ms. Ridge. We dragged Ken Fultz into this. It was all hands-on for the entire week last week, so I do appreciate everybody's tireless hours in trying to work through this and get this together.
Well, if you don't mind, I want to thank the administration for doing that, because that's a terrific thing that you've done, and all the timing and that sort of thing. I'm sure that hopefully when something like this might happen to us, those schools might come after us too and help us. It's a good thing.
All right, so as chair, it's always been my style to make sure that, oh, please, Nancy.
She's way over here.
Yeah, I know, I can't see.
She's such a jump in like I do.
This is very difficult for me because I know when planning, they came back in February to the meeting, that was 5 months ago. I mean, why are we wait 2 weeks before this, and all of a sudden it's an emergency? And I don't understand. I feel like we are being dragged into the end of the pool inhabited by sharks because, you know, the planning of the school board wasn't done. I mean, it's not your first project. You just did Lincoln Elementary, you know what timelines are, you know how to draw funds for a bond, and what happened here, and I feel like now we're having to make up for the problems that have been, for whoever's fault. If it wasn't the school board, maybe it was the attorneys, I don't know, but it seems like we're having to make it work, and because of the poor planning that has gone on before. And not that we shouldn't do this, maybe we should, I'll have to think about it, but you know, we're suspending some codes, and I guess maybe Mr. Schnutzer's point is right, as if the health and safety is still going to be done, but, you know, something goes wrong because of we've reversed the orders, then they're going to drag us in and say, well, the city said waive the codes. You know, they waived the order, and, you know, I just see the potential for us being blamed for this when it's not our fault at all. But so that's, I guess, I do have a question. If we don't do anything, can they still go ahead and, do we have to waive the codes in order for them to start?
So if you didn't do anything, essentially you wouldn't be accommodating this, you know, this request to work it out. They will have at this point sought to work it out with you. And if you don't do something, then they will, my opinion, have satisfied the requirement under Brownfield to have sought to work it out, which gives them the right to go to court. And they could, my expectation is, given the amount of money, they'd go to court and say to the court, we want a temporary restraining order that gets you in front of a judge in a couple of days, and say to the judge, you know, their process they're putting us through, we're not required to go through it, we're not required to follow the permitting, and planning and zoning doesn't have a right to tell us good idea, bad idea, and we got to go. We're going to lose a bunch of money. And I think I've done this a long time, and I've been on a lot of TRO hearings, and judge is going to look at your counsel and say, go get this worked out. And don't come back here and tell me you don't have it worked out. Honestly, you're not going to put me in the position of, you know, wanting to go against the school district on this. Frankly, then, if it doesn't get worked out, you're going to go to an immediate, almost immediate, within 2 weeks, consolidated hearing on a preliminary and final injunction. It'll be a trial on the merits, and it will happen fast because of the school's assertions of extreme financial on this, and you'll get a court decision on it. But I think they will have cleared the hurdle of trying to work it out at this point. So I don't think a court will hold back at that to take it on. But the first reaction of the court is going to be to tell the parties, get it worked out.
Nancy, if I may, when all push comes to shove, you should always blame the attorneys.
All right, we got that now. Put that in there.
So, all right, so, thank you, Nancy. Ray, you stole a little bit of my thunder, because that's sort of the direction I want to go. But publicly, we heard a narrative and we heard discussion from you, Ray, and by council a little bit, where there's been ongoing dialogue, and the school and you and the city have been meeting and then talking about these things. Some of the terms, though, I really quiver and take point with, and the use of the word fault, the use of word sharks, and that kind of stuff, I think is erroneous. Let's not forget that the state of Ohio in 1980, with the Brownfield decision, already established a path. So with that in the backdrop, if the schools and the city have been talking about, what we're basically essentially saying, and I think Ray said it best, is that council, we need you to just temporarily turn off the final plat development and the design review part while the schools are actually going to be doing stuff. I can tell you, as somebody who's managed multiple development projects, timelines get screwy sometimes, and project management 101, it becomes a nightmare almost. So I applaud the city, I applaud the mayor and her staff for taking interest, as I am a trustee of the city, but I also understand that the schools are actually under the gun. They have very complicated funding mechanisms to do their high school. They have a very complicated, in my opinion, structure that they want to develop, and so it is what it is. And so council is being asked to just do this temporary thing. What I also like is the fact that we have 3 planning commission members here, and it's my understanding, because Ray, you and I talked about process, that does planning commission understand what is going to change and what their mechanisms are before them?
I believe so. As I said, I met with them prior to this meeting about 6:30 and went through this whole thing, and I hope they understand. If not, I'm happy to meet with them again. So.
Good. Okay. Well, so I think I'm just going to stop there. And again, I see this as, yes, this is a very unique, very odd, in all the time that I've been here on council, I've never, but who's to say that tomorrow or next week we're going to have something else odd? It seems to be the way things are going these days. But, so,
I have just one
do we
more
have,
little
well, is this going to be on regular agenda?
question. Oh, I think so.
Okay. Clerk, did you get
My
that?
question is, will there be a time frame that will be given to the planning commission that this doesn't go on for a long time and being forgotten, the things that need to be coming through to them?
Well, it sounds like they're definitely involved.
Yeah. But will there be a time frame from the educational people there, right there?
Schools.
The schools? Or
Well,
will
Ray,
we have, are you going to get together and
Well,
make that?
they get to, in some part, control their destiny, and they've told us that their immediate needs is this site work stuff. So we have, and again, they can only work to the extent they have permits. So that's clearly in there. So to the extent they can get their permits, they can work. And so they kind of control their destiny on that timing, with the caveat that those 2 big off-sites aren't going to necessarily preclude them from going forward on their on-site work, that's the traffic and the sewer, but they face the need to resolve that before you'll approve occupancy, and with the knowing restriction of potential limitations coming out of that. So This was designed to give them more control of their destiny, in other words, getting this stuff done, but to cut your system so that it could be done piecemeal instead of in the whole.
I would add that the entire construction team for the high school project, as well as our internal team, have been having biweekly meetings regularly since the end of February when we had our first meeting. And that in between those 2 weeks of meetings, there are multiple conversations that happen between our engineering department, their engineers, et cetera. So those meetings have been scheduled, I believe, into the future on an ongoing basis, and will be continuing. So I think it's to everyone's best interest to make sure that all of these outstanding issues get resolved as quickly as possible, so that as they continue to go through the next year and the year after, because this is a 3-year phased project, that these things get buttoned up and they're able to move forward without any other issues, and we can get everything resolved so that things are smoothly. Certainly as cost continues to escalate, it makes sense that everybody gets things locked in as soon as they can. So as those meetings continue to happen and timeframes begin to become, I think, more identifiable and narrowed, that certainly Planning Commission will be kept in the loop on that. Director Blackford always gives updates at Planning Commission as well, as part of his presentation at the end of those meetings. So I know he's been keeping Planning Commission updated throughout this process.
Good. Any other questions? Okay. So regular agenda next week. All right. Thank you. Item E, items from the Department of Parks and Recreation.
All right, good evening. Heavy dose of Parks and Recreation for you this month in honor of Parks and Recreation Month. Tonight is a request for a resolution to adopt the Parks and Recreation pricing policy as recommended by the Parks and Recreation Board. This policy is reviewed annually, and it sets the charges and fees for any type of membership and programs for the department. The changes that were made were ultimately to better define the operation. None of the policy was ultimately changed. Again, it was just to better define within the document. Happy to answer any questions that there are.
Sorry. Any questions?
That's pretty straightforward.
Okay. Is this going to be consent agenda?
Fine by me.
Not much change.
Okay.
Thank you.
Director Farrell, thank you. Okay, item F, items from the Department of Finance.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Have a request for establishment of a new fund in front of you. This is for the One Ohio opioid settlement, which the city is participating in. Over an 18-year period, the city will receive an annual distribution from the settlement. This is broken into two parts of 55%, which is a base amount, and 45%, which is based on incentives, and those are going to fluctuate from year to year. Those amounts go to the state. And then from the state, the local governments, like the city, is guaranteed 30% of that distribution. And that 30% is stagnant, as well as the percent the city will receive at 0.0724%. So we did receive our first settlement July 18th. It was EFT'd, it is secured, but we did not have the fund established. So this is requesting an ordinance to establish the One Ohio fund to place the settlement funds in as they're received.
Mr. Weaver, sorry.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director. There are restrictions on what these funds can be used for, correct?
Correct. It's all laid out in the settlement. So as we're going through what those purposes are in the settlement document, we'll identify an appropriate program or way to use the funds. That's why this is just to establish and not asking for any appropriations at this time.
That's good. Thank you.
Any other questions? Is consent agenda okay? Okay.
Money in, man.
That's right. Well, it's establishment of the fund, that's right.
I consent to that.
All right, item G, items from the Department of, and Joanne, thank you. Items from the Department of Public Service and Engineering.
Good evening. The first item I have for you this evening is a request to waive competitive bidding for the traffic signal cabinet at US 62 and Old Ridenour. This traffic cabinet was recently hit by a vehicle as of about 10 a.m. this morning, and also about 2 months ago now. So the cabinet was originally struck late May during a vehicle accident that knocked it off its foundation a few feet away. And then once again this morning, it was knocked off its foundation and a few feet away.
I just want to say, I told Grant to just mention it was hit this morning and that we were being proactive in bringing this forward.
Sorry, I missed that. So it, as I mentioned, it knocked it off its pedestal. It damaged the cabinet, of course, the internal components, the foundation, and the fiber optic lateral. Basically, it took everything inside and just ripped it all out twice.
Twice.
It has been temporarily reconnected again, and it is operational, but some of the equipment, such as the vehicle detection cameras, are not currently operational just because it's destroyed and it's not able to be repaired in kind. So we have obtained a copy of the police report from the previous one. I don't have one from today yet, but I know there were officers on the scene. And we have confirmed that the first driver does have insurance. As with all damage to city property, we will be pursuing reimbursement from the driver and their insurance company. So pursuant to Gahanna Code, Chapter 135.05 E3, we are requesting an exemption from formal bidding for emergency purchases. The emergency purchase will allow us to take immediate action by hiring a contractor to replace the cabinet components, fiber lateral, to preserve the community's health, safety, and welfare. As I mentioned, the first accident did occur roughly 2 months ago. It has taken this long to obtain at least one quote back due to supply chain issues and material shortages. It has certainly been a long process, even getting a quote, let alone ordering and acquiring materials and labor. So we want to move on this as expeditiously as possible.
Yes.
Is there a reason that that maybe it should be a different place?
We asked the exact same question.
If it's been twice in 2 months?
We
Or
asked the-
is it because we had some people that were not driving correctly?
Yeah, so we asked the same question ourselves. This is the first time that I'm aware of the cabinet being hit. The first accident that occurred in May was due to a driver trying to game the yellow light, and they got caught with another car turning. So it was a multi-car accident. Today, I'm not sure the circumstances that caused today as of yet, but I don't have reason to believe that it's in an inopportune location that's subject to damage.
Thank you.
Mr. Snetzer.
I was just going to say, I think an important factor here is to recognize that these are monies that are likely to be reimbursed by insurance, correct? So correct. We would pay up front, but ultimately recoup the cost, and so I think the request is reasonable given those circumstances.
This wasn't a stolen car, was it?
I don't know.
There's a lot of those lately. I mean, it has to be done.
He
It's
says
just-
no.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you. Consent agenda, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Next one?
The next one is a supplemental appropriation for this cabinet. So we do not budget this much money throughout the year. We budget a small amount for maintenance or repair items. So we are seeking a supplemental appropriation so that we can move forward with the repair items. As Councilman Schnetzer mentioned, we will be seeking reimbursement from the driver and their insurance company to recoup these costs. So we're respectfully requesting an appropriation of $90,000, which includes 10% contingency for unforeseen costs, such as someone hitting it again today. And we are requesting an emergency and waiver so that we can get moving on this right away.
Okay, is 43 with this as well?
I'm sorry?
Is 43-2 the?
Oh, no, this is separate.
Okay, okay. Consent agenda okay for this supplemental? Okay. Please proceed.
All right. The next two items are our standard quarterly supplementals. So the first item is damage to city property. So we have received funds from damage to city property. So we are requesting supplemental to move those funds back to the respective expense account that was used to make the repairs. And then the second item is water meter fees. So we have purchased water meters, or developers have purchased water meters and have paid for those. So we are respectfully requesting to move those funds back to their expense account as well.
Okay, on 43, 2022 consent agenda? And what about 44 for the water meter fee? Consent? Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Grant, thank you. We're almost done with this agenda. Item H, items from the council office. Resolution designating August 2022 as a Safe Driving and Share the Road Awareness Month in the city of Gahanna. Seems timely, especially with people hitting our property. Any questions or comments about this? All right. Consent agenda, yes, thank you. All right. Move to adjourn, committee of the whole.
So moved, sir.
The gavel is.
Mr. Van Meter, just let me know when you're ready for finance. That was quick, thank you. So let's kick off Finance Committee for July 25th, 2022. We just have one discussion item on there, just a small clarification. I'm being told that while this is a facilities presentation, some of the attachments do not pertain to this discussion. This discussion is regarding financing options should the subject project move forward. So with that, Director Burry, you have the floor.
She's preparing.
Yeah. Oh, Kevin's doing it? Okay. Got it. All right, so with me tonight, I do have some guests that are here to answer questions. Brian will also give a presentation after mine. This is Brian Cooper with Baker Tilly. He's our municipal advisor. And we have Price Finley with Berker and Eckler. He's our bond counsel.
Turn that on.
It is on? Oh, got it. Okay. Got it. So tonight, we'll go over an overview of the recommended financing should the project move forward. We'll talk about the impact on the capital improvement plan, and then Baker Tilly will talk about the actual issuances themselves in a little more detail, and then we'll take any questions that anybody has. So as with any large project, the best solution is to finance the project with an issuance of debt. There's a couple reasons for that. Better cash flow forecasting, so you're not expending large amounts of cash at one time. Allows other projects to move forward at the same time. The only thing that would be due would be the debt service, so other funds could be used for other projects. Avoids an overaccumulation of taxpayer dollars, so it just puts public money to work faster. And then it reduces the risk of resources being diverted for other purposes. Debt may be issued on a long-term or short-term basis. And with local government, there are three main types of debt that may be issued. There's the general obligation, which pledges the full faith and credit and taxing power of the city, and that pertains to property taxes only. Special obligation debt, where the city would pledge municipal income tax. Tax increment financing debt, where the city would pledge payments in lieu of taxes. For this particular project, it is recommended that the city would issue general obligation debt in two parts. The first would be short-term and the second would be long-term. The short-term would be a one-year note for acquiring the property only. And then the second part would be the long-term issuance. That would refinance the note on a long-term basis, as well as pay for the construction and renovation of the property. The reason why this would be done in two parts is a couple reasons. One of the main ones is compliance with arbitrage rules. The IRS requires that bond proceeds be spent down 85% within the first 3 years. So we don't want to rush the other components that would go along with this. Design, architectural work, selecting a contractor, procuring materials. So we wouldn't issue the long-term piece of this until some of that was already set or we started down those processes. Gives us that time to go through the process and also reduces the risk that we're going to issue too much debt, not issue enough debt, or that we're going to be in non-compliance with the arbitrage rules. There are two types of general obligation debt. There's voted and unvoted, and there are limitations on how much can be outstanding at any one time. This is going to be an unvoted issuance, which means that no new taxes are going to be requested for the project. And the debt limitations Baker Tilly will go over in their presentation. The insider unvoted property tax millage is not going to be enough for the annual debt service. So the remainder will primarily come from issue 12 income tax resources, or the 75% of the 1% increase. We did kind of identify some other sources that could potentially be used. This facility will also house Mayor's Court. So the Mayor's Court building funds could be used. We would investigate and see if there's any grant funding that may be available for this type of project. And then looking at the legislation that established our tax increment financing districts, does that legislation allow for this type of capital improvement? And is it located in an area that we could potentially use some of that payments, those revenues in lieu of taxes to fund some of the debt? So just kind of wanted to look at how this kind of aligns with our debt policy. It will not exceed the maximum duration allowed, or 30 years. We've specified the source of repayment with the income tax dollars for capital improvement. We've also identified some other sources that could potentially be used. It will be issued as general obligation debt because it is a non-enterprise capital improvement. The municipal advisors of the city considered all options for financing, and general obligation debt is the most advantageous for the city for this particular project. And the use of the debt for this purpose aligns with the city's goals to ensure assets are in a condition to deliver quality services in a safe environment. So then finally, what does this mean for our other projects that we know that we have out there? Foremost, the debt service has to come first, and then we would look to the CIP for how other projects would fit in, knowing that debt service has to come first. The debt limitations for general obligation debt are also only related to GO debt. So there could potentially be other financing options if needed, depending on what capacity we may have. And we could look to other resources. There's grants that are available. We do still have a portion of the ARP funds that we haven't used yet. We could also look at street and state highway funds. The street fund specifically is retiring some other debt that's outstanding. The city has issued long-term debt like this for other projects in the past, Creekside improvements, street rebuilds, Morrison Road rebuild, various other reasons. So as that debt kind of rolls off in the next 8 to so years, those funds can then potentially be used to help offset other projects, or depending on which fund it is, maybe even help offset some of the debt service for this particular project. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, we've been reactionary for so long, when we didn't have funding. We now have this capital money that we could be strategic with, and it's not going anywhere. So it's going to be around for a long time. So, in just looking at this project, I believe it's fiscally responsible and prudent. It addresses our facilities in a great way by taking care of our most viable group, the public safety group, And the size is kind of a bonus because it also takes care of 2 other facilities at the same time. So I think it's just a feasible project to do. So with that, I will now turn it over to Mr. Brian Cooper, who will talk a little bit more about the debt issuances themselves.
All right, technology works. We're all set. Good evening, everyone. Joanne, thank you for the introduction and the overview, including the capital planning portion of the project. I'm here today to talk about the ordinance that's before council for the issuance of various purpose notes or capital facilities notes. My apologies. And just wanted to hit on some of the goals and objectives of the specific financing that we're talking about, and also talk about the long-term plan. The short-term plan involves acquiring the property site for the new municipal complex. That will include the issuance of notes to purchase the property. The longer-term plan will be to issue bonds to repay the notes and make further improvements to the property once that planning process is completed. And then I'm going to walk briefly through the process of issuing notes and bonds. And then we also want to provide for the execution and sale and execution of the notes on behalf of the city. So the short-term plan of finance is for the property acquisition itself. We have a not to exceed amount of $8.5 million. The estimated interest on those notes, subject to market conditions, is about $255,000. So the debt service on that one-year note would be about $8.7 million. And you can see there the purpose clause. The purpose of the notes will be to acquire and construct and renovate the municipal facilities in accordance with the project plan. We're looking at a general obligation. We're looking at a general obligation with an income tax pledge on this that will help exempt this debt from the direct debt limit. The indirect debt limit, the 10 mil limit, will still be in play, however, so this will count against that debt limit. We're looking at using tax-exempt bonds, notes to do this, with a one-year maturity. The estimated rate on this are about 3%. Note rates have been in the range of about a 260 to a 280 for one-year notes. We have seen rates as high as 3% in the recent markets, and I'll touch on that here on the next slide. This is a historical look back of the MIG-1, which is a short-term note index. You can see the spike in 2020 with COVID, and then after January 1, we have seen short-term rates rising dramatically, and we are currently at a peak for short-term rates since even before the pandemic. Whenever you're issuing notes, we want to look forward to the long-term plan. We realize that this is not an $8.5 million project, but rather a project in the realm of $60 to $61 million. And so what we wanted to provide council was a snapshot of what that would look like over 25 and 30 years. We've split this up just for visual purposes between police and non-police, so you can see those corresponding project sizes. And over 25 years, the current estimated rates for this type of financing would be about a 386, and over 30 years, it's a 406. So you can see the difference between the short-term rates and the long-term rates under this market stress are starting to converge. The $60 million projects or $61 million project over 25 years will have an approximate average annual debt service of about $4.3 million per year. And over 30 years, while the interest rate is slightly higher for that structure, The longer amortization provides for an annual debt service of just under $4 million per year. And then the following page shows that on an annual basis, we're running these assumptions with a level debt service, so the city pays the same amount every year. You don't have an escalating bond payment. With respect to long-term interest rates, this is the tax-exempt AAA MMD. You can see this follows almost exactly where short-term rates are as well. You see the spike in 2020 during the pandemic, and the 10-year MMD index also rising at a very quick pace, although we have seen some relief in this market over the past few weeks. We've seen a little stabilization and rates actually coming down just a little bit, which is good, but nowhere near where we were, at the in mid-2021. Also wanted to provide a quick debt summary of the city's current outstanding debt. You've got three purposes outstanding currently: 2013, 2015, and the city's judgment bonds that were issued in 2020. Overall, your outstanding par is about $18.9 million, and that is considered a moderate debt profile, moderate to light debt profile, as compared to other cities with a AA1 credit rating. Credit rating considerations. The city is rated AA1. That's the second highest rating from Moody's Investor Service. This is a very strong credit rating. When the credit rating agencies look at you, they look at four main areas. They look at your economy, your finances, your management, and your debt and pension obligations. We have done some detailed work with Joanne in the mayor's office on your current scorecards and how this additional debt may impact your current credit rating. Add to that the fact that Moody's is currently in the midst of updating their credit criteria. So we've looked at it three ways: your current rating, your rating with additional debt, as well as tried to apply the new metrics, which are not yet in effect. And the long story short is that at AA1, we would expect your rating to hold with the issuance of new debt, and we've gone into that detail with Joanne in the mayor's office. As far as next steps with respect to issuing the notes, the note legislation will be introduced, or has been introduced to City Council for review and approval. We intend with this market to use the Ohio Market Access Program through the State Treasurer's Office that will allow us to get an investment grade credit on these notes in very quick order. It's basically a credit enhancement program provided by the State Treasurer. It's also very low cost and easy to obtain. So I think that will do our best in keeping the rates as absolutely low as possible for the city. Once the city approves the note legislation, we will send this package out and set interest rates on or about October 19th, 2022. And after that pricing date, when we set interest rates, we will finalize the documents and prepare for closing, with a closing expected on November 2nd, which I believe will coincide with the need for funds to purchase the property. And then we'll be in communication with Joanne on the plan of finance as the city moves through the planning process with respect to construction, renovation of the facilities. So I will pause there and answer any questions you might have about the note process.
Anything from council on this particular topic?
Sounds good to me.
I have some questions, I guess, that are more high level, not necessarily pertaining to the note issuance, so I can certainly wait until later.
You want to wait till later?
I can, sure.
Or we can do it now?
So I think it was in Joanne's portion of the presentation, there was reference to the city, our own internal debt policy having a maximum term of 30 years for general obligation debt. I'm just curious, under, say, a hypothetical scenario where the city was willing to modify that term and extend it, is there anything in the Ohio Revised Code that would, I guess, prohibit us from issuing longer term in order to get that annual debt service figure down a little bit lower?
The answer is it depends. The answer is it
Perfect,
depends.
yeah.
So for the maximum maturity constraints outside of the city's debt policies are driven under 133, which is what you're using when you're issuing a general obligation. That dictates a maximum life for each asset that you finance. So if you're planning on using general obligation, then the maximum you're going to be able to issue for these improvements will be 30 years.
Okay.
If you go the general obligation route.
Okay.
There are some alternatives that you could consider, the city could consider, different types, non-general obligation, that you may be able to go longer. And there's other structures that you could pursue, albeit at a higher cost.
Sure. So
It's possible.
So technically possible, but from like a practical perspective, probably not in the city's best economic interest to have that sort of lower security.
Yeah, generally I
option.
would agree with that, yeah.
Okay, perfect. And then I guess the other question I have is, and I'm not sure who's necessarily best to answer this, but I think a key characteristic of this potential project as it's being proposed is the ability to completely vacate this site. And I guess what I mean by that is, I think what's clearly driving that, the biggest need of the community is the fact that, police headquarters is just not adequate. If PD were simply to vacate their site, it kind of leaves a bit of a donut hole in this site, and so we're not able to kind of capture the value. Whereas if we can package everything, City Hall, the police headquarters, as well as the senior center, and move everything to a different site, which allows this site to be sold. I suppose the question that I'm driving at here is, how could those sale proceeds of this site be allocated? Could they be allocated to, in some way, I guess, the debt liability that would be associated with 825 Tech Center? Or because money's fungible, does it just not matter? We just put it in a fund and use it for capital improvements on a go-forward basis?
Well, I think you could, if you sold this property, if you sold an asset, you can use those funds for other capital projects if you wanted. But if you wanted to utilize the sale proceeds and reduce the amount of debt outstanding, you would have to do some forethought in your issuance. And what I would suggest is, when you go to permanent bonds, if there's an amount, so let's say the project is 60 million and you think maybe this site is worth 10 million. I'm just pulling numbers out of my hat. Sure. You might want to do $50 million of permanent financing and then keep 10 million, for example, in notes, so that if you sell this property, those notes, you could use the proceeds of that property to redeem a portion of the notes. Once you're in a long-term fixed rate bond, you're not going to be able to call the bonds for, at a minimum, 5 years, and the average, more typical call period would be 10 years. And so once you're in a permanent financing, it becomes hard to use money, whether it's from the sale of this asset or any other available monies to pay down debt on a permanent financing.
Okay, thank you. Anything from council before, Mr. Weaver?
One additional question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for being here this evening. If I recall from when we were doing the town hall meetings at the senior center, when we were having this conversation about millage and inside and unvoted and voted millage, for what I'm getting this evening is we are okay and aren't going to hit that thresholds. Are we still okay when it comes to other taxing authorities that may issue a levy, such as like Abatement or senior options or other taxing authorities?
For the overlap.
Were they? Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the debt limit that you're subject to on the general obligation indirect debt limit is the 10 mil limit.
Yes.
And once we move up to that $60 million level, almost all of the 10 mills for that calculation are taken. There's a little room, and for each taxing authority, the amount they can issue with that remaining millage is dependent on their assessed value. So it would be a case-by-case basis of how much room. That being said, if any taxing districts wanted to go on for additional voted millage, they could do that anytime, no problem. So it wouldn't limit other taxing authorities to go out and seek additional voted millage.
I appreciate the distinction. Thank you.
Anything? Yep, Mr. Renner.
Thank you. So a question popped in my head, and so forgive me that this is probably a little bit basic, but I was going through your slides in my head, and you did a nice job of separating short-term, long-term, and all the short-term is going to be used to purchase the building, and then the long-term to do the activities that we need to do. But so now fast forward to what you just said, and I know you you had project numbers up there based on the total budget of 60.9 or whatever that number is, but in reality, it's that number minus the purchase, right? And so, and I guess that's just a clarification point. And I understand that your point is whether it's 50, whether it's 60, these are the annual payments and this is what we're looking at, right?
Yep, that's correct.
And then to what you were just talking about, if it's more 50-ish, then how, I guess, it's just logic that we're further away from that 10
Mill debt limit.
That's right, the 10 mil debt limit, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything further from council before we, yep. Mrs. McGregor?
This is probably, I think you partially answered. We can't do anything to refinance for about 10 years. But after that, if the rates were lower, can we refinance the bonds?
Absolutely. So the standard call is a 10-year call. The range of call options are anywhere between 5 and 10 years. And this would be on the permanent financing a
Right.
year from now. And when council approves an ordinance for bonds, there'll be some language in that ordinance giving or dictating the right of the city to be able to have a call to either prepay or refinance those bonds in the future. And when we go to market, what we'll present to Joanne is an analysis that shows what the cost is for a 10-year call and shorter. Because usually as you do a shorter call, the financing gets more expensive. And so we'll present Joanne with some options on the callability, and you typically try to balance the callability with optionality, so the ability to refinance in the future, which you've identified, with the cost of capital today as it's compared to other deals in the market.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Does the inflation issues that we are having now, is that part of this already? That
Well, number one,
are we expecting it not to go down rather than go up?
well,
further?
what we're showing you now is the interest rates now.
Oh, that's good.
So we haven't added or subtracted anything to these rates. And from my perspective, that's the easiest way to keep track of which way rates are going. Because if we added 50 basis points or 100 basis points, then when we came back in 6 months or a year, we'd have to continue to use that. And then we'd wonder, well, did it go up, or were we just buffering the numbers? So what is reflective in this presentation is where we see market rates right now for AA1. That's right.
Shall we continue? All right. Back to you guys.
All right. Well, I would encourage you, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Joanne. We're always happy to help in any way. So let us know if there's any other questions before council acts on the ordinances.
Sure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Joanne, do you have anything further or anything from Mr. Finley back there? I thought maybe you would take that ORC question, but Mr. Cooper jumped in front of you there, so you're off the hook. But anything further from council before we let everybody go? No, sir. Okay, all right, thank you. Thus concludes finance.